Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, I'm sure it does to this audience, but to a lot of people, particularly graduates of college recently or high schools across America, they might have no idea that I just read the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. It is unbelievable where we are today with the topic of speech, and there are so many things that we grew up saying or that we talked about even just a few years ago that are no longer allowable. They could cost you your job, your livelihood, your reputation. I want to go to a list that was brought forward by Ted Cruz at a recent conference because I think it illustrates the problem at hand. These are just a few examples of the sorts of things you might get in trouble for saying today. How about this one? America is great. Christopher Columbus and his discovery of America was a good thing. American heroes George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, better not say that anymore. Our founding fathers were extraordinary patriots, and you know the word patriot is now under attack. America has been a force for good in the world. That's provably true. Imagine this world without America, and yet you can't say it anymore. Police officers keep us safe. You might be attacked for defending the police. We should stand for our national anthem. Apparently that's become controversial. Marriage is a holy covenant before God. And boy, has that been eviscerated by Barack Obama and the Supreme Court. An unborn child is a child. Children do best when they're raised by a mother and a father. You know, I was fortunate enough to have a mother and a father and to be raised in a home like that. And it's not that others can't do a good job, but by our creation, we were meant to have a mother and a father. That's God's design for the family. Each mother and father bringing unique characteristics and qualities to the raising of a child. Here's another one. Israel's our friend. And the Wuhan virus came from Wuhan. How did that become controversial? It shows you how the language has been taken over. And finally, this used to be something that was not up for debate. And today it is. There is a difference between boys and girls. And by the way, there aren't only boys and girls. And by the way, you are assigned whether you're a boy or a girl at birth, but when you're assigned something, you can change it later if you don't agree with it. All of this is nonsense, and all of this is being used to corrupt our society and, frankly, to take control of the freedoms that we have been given and granted by God through our Constitution, protected by government. That's all under attack presently. Who controls the language controls the culture. We are at a critical point in the United States of America, and if we don't push back now to regain control of our language and our freedom of expression, the nation will be lost. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment.
Charlottesville's community watchdog, Rob Schilling.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. Border Hawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Michael Knowles, the host of the Daily Wire's The Michael Knowles Show, and also PragerU's The Book Club. He's a best-selling author, and the new book is Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Michael Knowles, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
It's great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
I think it's important to start out, as you cover in the book, a brief history of speech in America and why speech was considered such an important topic for the founders.
You know, this topic has been coming up at least over the last 30 years in America. We refer to political correctness or wokeness. The left attempts to redefine all the words in order to redefine reality. And some people believe this is just a minor political issue. It's a little bit of a sideshow. You'll hear people say these days, oh, who cares about the pronouns or something like that. Well, my answer to that is the left obviously cares about the pronouns. That's why they try to spend so much time and money and energy transforming the way that we use pronouns and every other kind of word. And the reason for this goes back to good old Uncle Aristotle. You know, we have speech so that we can persuade one another. But if we don't have that, then we'll just descend into grunting animals who just club each other over the head to pursue our own interests, which, frankly, is probably more what our politics resembles these days than anything else. So what we try to do is be able to refer to reality with our words. And what PC is set out to do is not even so much the overt censorship that we're all familiar with, you know, the big tech platforms kicking off the duly elected sitting president of the United States. That's a problem too. But it's the pre-censorship, the way that they manipulate language so that they transform our perception, and very often will win a debate before it even begins.
You know, it's interesting, this term pre-censorship, and I think a lot of people themselves in their own speech are pre-censoring. They're scared to say things now for fear they're going to be pounced on. Is that a deliberate strategy?
It certainly is. I mean, we refer to that as cancel culture, the idea that, and look, we're not just talking about a guy who shows up to the water cooler and starts spouting off racial epithets or something. We're talking about people who simply wave the American flag. We're talking about people who simply vote for the Republican candidate. They could seriously face reprisals at their jobs, in their schools, or anywhere else. And the trap that I feel conservatives have fallen into, and I talk about this at length in Speechless, is they have fallen for a trap whereby either way they react to that kind of cancel culture will actually advance political correctness. And what I mean by that is, you've got the one group, the squishes, they'll just give in to the new standards. They just will go along with whatever words we're supposed to say and do. Then there's the more stalwart group of conservatives. Let's call them the free speech absolutists. They say, well, we'll never go along with the new standard, but in so doing, they will often say that they will give up standards altogether, that people can just say and do whatever they want anytime. And that advances political correctness as well, because either way, the traditional standards are abandoned. And the whole point of this linguistic warfare is to upend traditional societies. So I think what we need to recognize is all societies have standards. All societies have taboos. That there's no such thing as totally pure, absolute free speech. Never has been in America, never has been anywhere else either. What we need to recognize is that PC is not just a battle between free speech and censorship, but a battle between competing sets of standards. And the example I use is, in the 1950s, you could be canceled for being a communist. Today, you can be canceled for not being a communist. The fact of cancellation has not changed. It's just the standards by which one is ostracized and by which one's speech is suppressed.
So it's very interesting, this concept of free speech and the free speech purists that you reference in the book. So what would be the better way, concisely, for people on the right to handle this issue? Instead of saying free speech, what should they be saying?
We need to learn a magic little word. It's only 2 letters long. Speaking of being concise, that word is no. We need to recognize that some things actually are off limits. The great example today is critical race theory. You'll see parents going to their school board saying, we need to get critical race theory out of the schools. Well, that's totally good. That's right. You know, the people who are arguing for CRT on the basis of, say, academic freedom, they're just totally misguided. Let's not forget, William F. Buckley Jr., as mainstream a conservative as they get, launched the modern conservative movement with a book that was an invective against academic freedom. That book was called God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. Because something like critical race theory, which effectively denies reality, denies objective truth, that sort of thing will actually undermine education. The reason that we have no free speech protection for, say, fraud or threats or obscenity is that those are the sort of things that undermine speech. They seem like speech, but they actually undermine speech. So we need to recognize that true liberty exists within limits, and liberty and licentiousness are not the same thing. And if we want to really have a flourishing free speech regime, as we've always had in America, we need to recognize that in order to do that, we have to say no to certain things.
And so for these parents, and I host them frequently here in Central Virginia, Michael, who are preparing to address the school board, what is the most effective speech that they could say or terms that they could use in objecting to critical race theory being taught in the schools?
Well, I go through critical race theory at some length in Speechless, and I trace the history of PC going back, not just to the 80s, but going back really to the 1920s and a little bit further back. And I think where this all begins is actually a throwaway line from Karl Marx. It's become cliche for conservatives to blame Marx for everything, but frankly, the guy was responsible for a lot of bad things. And he had a line where he called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And this then, by his intellectual errors, was developed into critical theory. Now we have critical race theory. You don't need to worry about the pretentious jargon. The theory is simple enough. The theory is to criticize everything. What this is really about is about a reframing of our own history and self-understanding. That's the language of the 1619 Project, for example. It's about reframing the country. And what the left understands is pictures have frames, and conservatives, I think, need to understand that as well. When they disingenuously on the left say that we're trying to not teach about slavery or something, that's obviously preposterous. But what we are saying is that some things are good, some things are bad, some things are right, some things are wrong. And so when we teach about, say, communism, and Ron DeSantis is actually picking this up in Florida, when we teach about communism, we're not saying don't ever mention Karl Marx in the classroom, but we need to teach that it's bad, it's evil. The left understands this, so they teach that America is evil, for instance, but then the moment you try to talk about the evils of communism or totalitarianism, they tell you that you are indoctrinating people ideologically and you're threatening academic freedom. It's just bunk, it's BS. Parents absolutely have the right to exert their own political power over their students' education. The left has always played this on one side. They get to control the education, and the minute that conservatives say boo, then they prattle on about academic freedom. The parents, what they are doing is absolutely right, and they should not be deterred by the disingenuous arguments of the left, which I break down in Speechless.
We're talking with Michael Knowles, and the new book is Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. You spent some time towards the beginning of the book talking about the right versus the left stylistically in the use of language, clarity and forcefulness versus oblique speech, vagueness. Tell us why that's important to understand.
Well, I think it's important because of this misunderstanding, because we sometimes say that political correctness is about free speech versus censorship, and really it's not. Yes, it's true that political correctness says that we can't say certain things and we have to behave in a certain way. But then so does chivalry. So does basically every code of speech that's ever existed. They always have some sorts of limits. So we need to recognize how we're using them. Political correctness uses euphemisms, right? Soft words to mask harsh realities. But we do that too. When we refer to a woman of a certain age instead of an old hag, we're using a euphemism. It's just to be polite. And when we say these sorts of things, it softens the reality, but it doesn't contradict it. Whereas with political correctness, very often the words are just outright contradictions of what they really mean. So my favorite example of this is a new term. It's used widely in legal and academic circles. It's a term for juvenile delinquents, and the term is justice-involved youth. And I saw that term. I scratched my head a little. I said, what is, you're talking about criminals. Well, that's strange, because criminals are by definition injustice-involved youths. They're certainly not involved in justice. And you see this time and time again. I mean, even the phrase politically correct is used to distinguish speech because it is not correct. When we refer to a trans woman, what are we referring to? We're referring to not a woman. And so we've really got to be on our guard, because if you really can negate reality and you can color people's perception this way, then you are going to fundamentally reorder our politics, as the left has very successfully done.
Michael, in the book, there's a very interesting case study regarding Antifa and the people on the right calling Antifa fascist, saying, haha, you're anti-fascist, but you're really a fascist. And this is super important because people are getting it wrong on the right. Tell us about that.
I think they are. There's a very simple joke, and we've all made it, which is we've observed the irony that the so-called anti-fascists resemble fascists in their tactics. I mean, they're even wearing black shirts like the original fascists in Mussolini's Italy. But the thing is, they're not really fascists. And this is just another example of the left reordering our language. Today, and this has been true for now going on 60, 70 years, the only bad thing in political ideologies is fascism. And George Orwell wrote about this. He said that today fascism has come to mean just something that I do not desire. All bad things are fascism. But it's not true. The Antifa people are not fascists. They're communists and anarchists. Fascism is this extreme ideology that's hard to classify, but it certainly has a lot of elements from the right side of the aisle. These people do not. These people are firmly on the left, and I think we need to recognize that while fascism is quite bad, so is communism and so is anarchism. And when we conservatives allow ourselves to go along with this idea that fascism is the only evil in the world, we're actually giving the left a huge premise. And getting back to Ron DeSantis, I think he's waking up to this in Florida. He's saying, wait a second, we teach about the evils of fascism. We teach about the evils of this, that, and the other thing. But we don't teach about the evils of communism and anarchism. We give these radical leftists a pass, and we need to stop giving them a pass in our classrooms, but most especially in our language.
So this is really interesting because we have the word anti-fascist shortened as Antifa, but now we have anti-racist education going on in the schools here. So it seems that a tactic of the left is to be putting the word anti in front of something, and then if you oppose them, you're obviously in favor of it.
Exactly. And the anti-racists are the most hilarious, because racism, again, is one of these words that has been watered down to mean absolutely nothing. By any definition of racism today, the most racist people in the country are the anti-racists. But we need to ask ourselves, what is racism? It seems to me a good working definition is when you have antipathy towards someone because of his race, because, the very simple idea. So are we racists on the right? I don't think so. I'm certainly not. It's an offense against human dignity. Okay, that's it. That's why we're not racists. But what about the left? Why is the left not racist? I think, increasingly they deny concepts such as human dignity, such as the transcendent moral order, such as the existence of God himself. And so they don't really have a good argument for why they're not racist, which is why they are, which is why they use these sorts of terms. That word, that R word, I think does more to intimidate and shut up conservatives than just about any other word. It's the worst thing you could possibly be called in the country, and so everyone is really worried about avoiding it. But I think we've got to get over that, guys. They're going to call us racist no matter what. We can blow our nose, they'll say it's a racist dog whistle. And by the way, they've defined racism now to be whether you admit or whether you deny your racism as a white person. You're just automatically racist. This is the talk of Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. So you've got to get over it. You've got to stop caring. I hope that you're not unjust toward people, but probably you're not anyway. And so ignore it. That this kind of mental prison is going to lock you up. Who cares what the left thinks of you? You need to have courage, which is not just a virtue, let's remember. It's the prerequisite for all of the other virtues.
We're talking with Michael Knowles. The book is Speechless. I want to go now to the month that we just finished, the problem with the word pride. This is fascinating to me, that something that in previous generations caused shame is now widely embraced in our culture as pride.
Yes, it seems like a little bit of a strange marketing ploy to use the deadliest of the 7 deadly sins as your moniker. Even, Gay Wrath Month or Gay Gluttony Month would probably, serve a little bit better. But really, it's not even about homosexual rights anymore. Now there's all sorts of pride. There was a piece in the Washington Post yesterday about a woman saying she brought her children to a kink pride display. It was just sort of men and women smacking each other with paddles and saying how wonderful this was. There's fat pride, skinny pride, slut pride. I mean, there are all of these things. And in a way, it really is fitting. Whittaker Chambers, the ex-communist who became a very important conservative leader in the 20th century, he wrote that communism is not the newest ideology. It's actually the great alternative faith of mankind that began in the Garden of Eden when the serpent told Eve, "Ye shall be as gods." There's this real hubris, this idea behind political correctness that by tinkering with the words, we can redefine reality. And so now we have this month. The other important aspect to think about with this, by the way, is that this is effectively a liturgical month. We believe in our country that we have a firm separation of church and state, and we live in a secular country. That's bogus. First of all, we never have. But also, at bottom, all politics is theological. So we have various saints' days, feast days. We just added a new feast day a couple of weeks ago. That would be the new sacred National Independence Day of Juneteenth. And we now have Pride Month. And actually, there's another month for LGBT in October. So a full 6th of the calendar year is dedicated to unusual sexual desires. Conservatives, again, fall into this trap of saying, for instance, you can't legislate morality. What does that even mean? You necessarily legislate morality. All laws do that, whether you're talking about the death penalty or whether you're talking about parking tickets. All lawmaking, it involves arguments that refer to some moral law. And so I think we need to get much more confident making those moral claims. That's what self-government is about. It's about your faculties of reason. It's about your moral conscience. And it's about using those things to craft your society. The simple fact is that free speech in the abstract doesn't mean anything to people who don't have anything to say.
Tangentially, Michael Knowles, the Black Lives Matter and this very strange queer advocacy that's going on, which is in complete contradiction to the views of traditional, faithful Black people in America.
This is ironic, and I think if BLM were not so talented at hiding its true designs, I think this would have alienated probably the majority of Black voters. They have since taken down their About Us page, but on their website, BLM used all sorts of crazy language. They said that they are a radical organization that seeks to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family. They use terms like cisgender and queer affirming and all sorts of absolute madness. And this is because, in the words of the co-founders of BLM, they are trained Marxists. Again, I don't want to sound like a nut saying that Karl Marx lies at the heart of this thing, but when they tell us that he does themselves, I think we ought to believe them. And so this is really a radical movement that recognizes that the fault line in America, in particular, is not class. It's not the working class versus the oppressors in the capitalist class. It's race. That's the fault line. And so they're pushing along the lines of race to divide America and sow social discord. This is what Marx's intellectual heirs began doing even in the 1920s, not always just with race, but with culture more broadly. They recognized that revolution cannot succeed if it does not possess the common sense. And so they really work on these very basic cultural levels. They realize man is not motivated primarily by occupational licensing reform and marginal tax rates. I don't know about you. I don't wake up in the middle of the night sweating about that. And so they focus on these issues, and BLM has done it incredibly effectively. BLM is not a formal political party, and yet, practically speaking, it's one of the most powerful political parties that has ever existed in our country.
I'd like to go back a little ways to Gramsci, whom you reference in the book, and the whole concept of cultural hegemony, and also this very, very abrupt U-turn in the meaning and use of the term cultural Marxism, which I've used frequently, and yet now it's under attack.
You're not allowed to use that term, because it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I just learned from Wikipedia about a year or two ago. It never was that before. And this is very strange that they're pushing this canard that cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. One, because there are many, many famous Marxist writers who specifically focus on areas of culture. This is a well-known intellectual movement. But moreover, the sort of Mac Daddy of cultural Marxism is an Italian guy, Antonio Gramsci, not a Jew. So I don't know where they get this from. There were a number of Jews involved in it, notably in the Frankfurt School that developed critical theory, and among them Herbert Marcuse, who then would return in the 1960s as the father of the New Left. So I'm not denying that, but it's such an obvious way to obfuscate and to use that R word, the racist word, to avoid answering these questions. The fact is, Marcuse and Fromm and Horkheimer and all these guys, and going back straight to Gramsci, recognized that the radicals needed to attain cultural hegemony. And Gramsci's insight was that the way to do this is not just through a war of maneuver, where you advance and retreat in a sort of traditional war, but rather through a war of position, where you infiltrate established institutions, you gain positions of power, and then once you have done that, you wield that power. This was reformulated later in the 1960s. A student radical named Rudi Dutschke was reading Gramsci through the lens of Mao, and he referred to this as the long march through the institutions. And this really began to explode after the second wave feminists of the 1970s in the campuses in the 1980s, and from the campuses throughout the rest of the country, because the elite class, the ruling class, became steeped in this sort of madness. I think this is why what you're seeing at the level of the school boards is so important. You're seeing a bunch of just ordinary parents showing up and saying, get critical race theory and these associated theories and gender theory out of our schools. And then you have the preening ruling elites who say, oh, posh, you don't even know what that is, you unwashed people. How do you know? You haven't even read your Gramsci. And I think that is a sign of hope, because it's showing further alienation between the ordinary Americans and this radicalized ruling class. I mean, it's actually that problem that Gramsci saw, that they don't possess the common sense. That gives me a glimmer of hope, but you need to recognize this thing has not been going on for 20 or 30 years. This thing's been going on now for the better part of a century.
And as you reference in the book, a cultural upheaval is seen as a prelude to political revolution, which is why all of us should be paying attention, because this is cultural upheaval nationwide on many fronts.
Well, yes. A good example of this is what the second wave feminists did in the 70s. You hear this phrase, the personal is the political. It's from a famous essay by Carol Hanisch. Mm-hmm. And in this essay, she described what I refer to as wine and cheese soirees, WHINE, where these women would show up to the New York radical women's groups, and they were perfectly happy bourgeois housewives and mothers, and they would show up and they would be told that they were oppressed and miserable. They had never felt that way before, but they then had their quote-unquote false consciousness shattered. They had their awareness and consciousness raised, and they left those soirees miserable and really opened up all of their personal involvement, their relationships with their husbands and their kids and who washes the dishes, to public and political scrutiny. The left has done this very, very effectively. When we talk today and say, why is everything so political these days? Things used to be private and settled. The reason for that is we used to have a consensus in this country, right? We used to have an idea about the roles between the sexes and complementarity and how the economy works and how political rights work. And then that was totally exploded. It was unsettled through cultural upheaval. And so now those are political questions. And my message for conservatives who just wish that, our chicken sandwiches and our running shoes and our football wasn't so politicized anymore. My point is, it already has been, but it's gone from the settled consensus where we can have a broad private life to this new political debate, and we're not going to be able to return to that settled private life until we either win or lose that political debate. There's no running from it. You might not care about the culture, but the culture cares about you. And so you can either step up and assert your own political vision, have the courage to offer a substantive view of politics. Or, now that the culture has been ripped up, it is going to be resettled along the lines of the left, and I don't think we're going to like that very much.
Conservatives are constantly losing, the strategies are bad, and the messaging failures are obvious. So is it a matter of studying more? Why is it that the left typically outflanks the right in all these areas?
I do think it's a matter of studying more, in the sense that I think we need to take our opponents seriously. I think we dismiss these people who create political correctness. We dismiss the snowflakes and all these people. Mm-hmm. We do that at our own peril. Something I learned while writing this book and researching this book is that the leftist intellectuals who gave us political correctness, they actually understand free speech and censorship much better than we do. And they understand the tactics much better than we do. And I think that we need to learn from them. And I think we don't want to do anything immoral, and we obviously don't want to adopt their substantive views, but we should adopt their tactical views, because they're very smart at this sort of thing. And then once we understand that, once we get over our own sort of self-flattery that we get this thing better than they do, then we need to have courage. That I'm reminded of the Breitbart maxim, politics is downstream from culture, mm-hmm. which is true in the sense that the movies influence politics. It's also true, though, that political systems influence the culture, and they're not always so easy to separate. Today, East Germany is atheist and West Germany is religious, not because of differences in bratwurst, but because of the Soviet regime that dominated there. So that would be an example of culture being downstream from politics. I think a lot of times politicians use that phrase because they just don't want to do anything. They want to pretend as though it's somehow unjust to exercise our political rights in the authentically political sphere. And that cowardice is going to kill us. I think we need real courage. And if we're not getting it from our Republican or conservative leaders, we're going to need to get that from ordinary people. You're seeing a little bit of that at the school boards. I think we need to see a whole lot more of that in a lot of other sectors of our society.
Michael Knowles, the new book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, is so important. If people would like to get a copy of that book, or if they'd like to follow you online, Michael, tell us how, please.
So you can get a copy anywhere books are sold. We actually have the happy problem right now of we've officially been named #1 national best-selling book last week.
Wow.
So that's great, really great news. I'm so pleased to hear it. I'm so glad conservatives are digging in on this issue. The downside is a lot of bookstores are sold out. So you can check your bookstore, you can get it at Amazon or wherever else. And you can find me online on Twitter at Michael J. Knowles, and at the Daily Wire podcast at PragerU, and with Senator Cruz on our podcast Verdict.
Michael Knowles, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Truly appreciate your work.
All right. Thank you, Rob. So great to be with you.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.